right, friends. Greg Koukl here, back in the saddle again. Fresh back from Wisconsin 2 nights ago. I've been there for a few weeks with my family. It was a great time. It's always satisfying to be away in a certain sense, especially in that environment for me. I love our place in northern Wisconsin. I've been going up there since 1962. I was 12 years old when my grandpa bought that property. I had about a 15-year hiatus after high school and into college and moving out to the West Coast. And then in the mid-'80s, I started returning, and my mom summered up there because my grandpa had died, and she got the place, and now my mom's gone, and it has fallen to me, and we fixed it up and refurbished it and made it habitable. And now I really have a good time there. But I actually have some sad news to share with you that I want to start out with. But I'll say this, that it, in a certain sense, in a very significant sense, it has a good ending. So there are 5 kids in our family. Susan's the eldest, a year and 2 weeks older than I am. Mark is 2 years younger than me. Dave is 2 years younger than Mark. And Bonnie, the youngest, is 2 years younger than Dave. So she's 6 years younger than me, or I should say was, because I lost my sister last week. Actually, in a sense, I misspoke there because Bonnie wasn't lost. She was saved. She's just left us for a while, and we will meet again. Even so, this has been kind of a tough week for everybody. The first to go, the youngest, and we're going to miss her. Now, I had a wonderful opportunity to spend with her, though. She, a couple of years ago, got cancer. She was a smoker for many years, got lung cancer, and beat it. And afterwards was put on a regimen that was meant to help her keep from falling back into cancer again, remission, out of remission, however you want to put it. And her doctor put her on a bunch of steroids. Apparently it was too much. And she began losing control of her muscles. And so she couldn't walk then, and she couldn't get up, and she couldn't use her hands well, and after a while, she couldn't even swallow. And that caused her to lose a lot of weight. And that was not good. So she was at a special program at the University of Chicago to see if they can get her out of this syndrome. And since she was in Chicago and I was in northern Wisconsin, that's a 6-hour drive. My wife and I and my 2 daughters, we all decided we're going to go down to see Bonnie. That was 2 weeks ago. And I just want you to know that was wonderful. I don't get to spend a lot of time with my sister. I haven't over the years. But it was wonderful to see her again and see how she was, even though she was emaciated, hardly recognizable to me. Even so, there was a certain glow about her, a certain sweetness that I had actually never seen before. And it was because of the hardship that she was struggling through with Jesus. Now, there was some reason to think that she would get over this. The hospital was helping her. The steroid problem would wear off after a while. They just had to get some food in her, and they were going to give her a feeding tube. And because she's just, when she tried to drink even, she would aspirate and then have problem with her lungs, etc. So they ended up moving her to another facility closer to her home, and then things got worse. She aspirated again. They weren't able to give her the feeding tube because her O2 levels were low, and they were waiting to see what happened, and she just went downhill like within a couple of days. And then she was gone, July 3rd. Her passing, obviously, and this is true, I think, for a lot of people, they end up thinking about a lot of things related to this. Not only is there anguish and mourning and a sense of loss, but also a sense, I think, of our own vulnerability. When you're younger, it's not quite as obvious, but now I'm 74, and she's the youngest of the siblings, and now one of 5 is gone. And, you can't help thinking, who's next? And you realize something that David himself said, and it's repeated a few times in the Bible, that our lives are like a vapor, a wisp. They are here, then gone. And sometimes when they're gone, they go quickly, and in the parting surprise us. In other words, we're caught by surprise. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. I guess the first thing that I want to say is that there are consequences to the way we live our lives. And this is like almost way too obvious. She was a smoker most of her life, and she got cancer. Now, she didn't die of the cancer. She beat the cancer, but she died of complications following the cancer. No cancer, no complications. Now, that's an obvious application for our lives, but to me, it's just, in a certain sense, symbolic, because we live in a culture that basically says, if it feels good, do it. If it makes you happy, if you enjoy it, go ahead. What's the problem? Now, that phrase came from the 60s, but it is operable now, in fact, more than ever. The prophet said, if you sow to the wind, you reap the whirlwind. Now it's you do you, but it's the same idea. And what people do is they live in the moment now for the pleasure of the moment, and they don't consider the consequences, not just health, physical health, but spiritual health as well. This idea, if it feels good, just do it. You're okay. You're not hurting anybody. Listen, we're not omniscient. We don't know what behaviors we participate in that are not consistent with God's purposes for us, that are going to come and visit us down the line. And this is true, doesn't apply in this situation, but is true with a lot of sexual behaviors. Oh, whatever. Do what you want, and then down the line, it comes back on you. Or family circumstances. Difficulties growing up in a family of origin that is harsh, and down the line it comes back on you. So all I'm saying now, initially, is just there are consequences to our behavior, which is why it's best to do the right thing before God in whatever it is we're facing, in whatever decisions we made, because only God knows the future, and He's telling us what to do that is the right thing because He understands how things work. Of course, that doesn't guarantee everything's going to go fine for us, but it does mean that we won't reap the consequences of evil behavior if we are not doing evil behavior. Simple little lesson there. But it's not the one that stands out for me. What stands out more is just a kind of reflection on dying and surprises that are associated with death. We did not expect Bonnie to pass. Not then. There were all kinds of reasons to have hope. And then within a couple of days of things being positive and upbeat, they turned and she was gone. In fact, she wanted to go home and die at home because she just was giving up, and there wasn't even time to get her home. It comes that fast sometimes. So there is a surprise sometimes in death, a surprise like, wait, really? I was just talking to them. They seemed fine. My understanding is, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but this is what I heard, that the first sign of a heart attack is instant death. The majority of people who have heart attacks don't survive. Just bang, and they're gone. And the same is true of accidents that are tragic. So death surprises us oftentimes. People think, well, I'll square things away with God later. I'll get my act together with God later. This presumes there is a later, that you know that there's going to be a later. Many times there is a later, but we don't know that. And boom, it's over. I was thinking that just driving down Weston Highway 70 towards our cabin from town, 2-lane highway. You realize that you're only 3 feet away, going 60 miles an hour, from a head-on collision with another vehicle, like hitting a wall at 120 miles an hour. 3 feet away. This is your margin. Now, of course, that doesn't happen very often, fortunately. But nevertheless, that's how close we are, even just doing something as pedestrian as driving down the freeway. That's why David said, teach us to number our days. Teach us to be aware that there is a limit, and we don't know when that limit is. We don't know whether in a whirlwind of circumstances tonight or tomorrow or the next day we'll be gone, or somebody that we love will be gone. Whenever I get on an airplane, I always text my wife and I say something sweet to her, because if something happens to me on the airplane, I want the last thing that she remembers me saying to her was something sweet. Because I'm just mindful of that. But of course, circumstances the last 2 weeks have made me more mindful of that, and it's good that we be reminded on a regular basis of the tenuous circumstances we're in. With all the medical advances, the death rate is still 100%. So death sometimes catches us by surprise, but there is another surprise in store for a massive number of people. I've heard that statistically, again, I don't have the bib source on this, but it doesn't surprise me, actually, that 65% of Americans actually believe in hell. And almost none of them think they're going there. 65% believe in hell, and almost none of them believe they're going there. Why would that be the case? I tell you what, it's not because they're 65% of the people in our country are deeply committed Christians who are trusting Christ to carry them and bring them to himself. No, I think a lot of people just think they're pretty good folk. They're decent people, and therefore that's all that's really necessary. When I was a young Christian, one of my teachers said there will be more good people in hell than any other kind. In other words, those kind of people that we look at and say, hey, they're fine chaps. Because it's those kind of people who don't realize how bad they actually are, according to God's standards, and how much danger they face. And this is the second surprise. It's not just the surprise that death catches us sometimes unaware, or those we love, and boom, it's over with. But the second surprise is the surprise many will experience on the other side. You know, this is it is an issue that was explored in Shakespeare's Hamlet. You may recall the famous soliloquy that starts, to be or not to be. That is the question. And Hamlet reflects on existence, living or dying, and whether it's nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them. In other words, to die. To sleep, to rest. And we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Notice the reflection there. Well, Once we end it, that will be rest. And of course, this is the argument of the doctor-assisted suicide crowd. They are suffering now instead of suffering with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in this individual. Let's just let them end their life and deliver them into rest. But you see, it's not that simple. Because, as Hamlet puts it, to sleep, perhaps to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil? That gives us pause. In other words, what's on the other side? Oh, we think it's rest. We think it's going to be easy. It's going to be great. Oh, okay, now they're at peace. We've said this many times about people who passed away. Now they're at peace. Really? We know this about all these people. Well, according to Jesus, they haven't passed into peace. They've passed many multitudes pass into judgment. And that's the surprise. The multitudes that will wake up on the other side, as it were, not to bliss, but to judgment. And Hamlet finishes, it's that dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, that puzzles the will. But it need not puzzle. And I think Shakespeare knew this. He's just speaking here of man's predicament and uncertainty, but there's no puzzle. We know. We know what's after the grave because one who has come back from the grave has told us. And that's significant, by the way. And the important thing here is that if someone dies and comes back to life again, then it seems to me that person might have something to say about what's on the other side. And I don't mean here one of those people who were gone for a few moments and or maybe even hours, and then came back and then wrote a book that became bestseller at Walmart. One person characterized these as heaven tourism books. I mean someone who is brutally beaten, then viciously murdered, then embalmed with over 100 pounds of chemicals, and sealed in a crypt. I'm not talking about an NDE. I'm talking about a stone-cold dead guy who then not 3 minutes later or 3 hours later, but 3 days later, when most corpses would be rotting and stinking, this guy got up and walked out of that crypt. Do you think that guy is worth listening to? I do. Of course, I'm talking about Jesus of Nazareth, right? And so he has given us reason to know what's on the other side and not be caught by surprise, though many will be because they don't take Jesus seriously. Not in the things they don't want to hear from him. Oh, they take him seriously when he says things they like do not judge. They don't keep reading that in Matthew 7. There's more that follows that first phrase of the first verse of that chapter that qualifies the statement. Oh, they're not in for that. They take the Bible literally in those areas that they like. The rest, no, it's dismissed. Nevertheless, their time will come. And they will cross over, as it were. And, you know, this is where reminiscent to me of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. And I was there, 12 years ago in Rome, and I saw this. And it's, if you've seen pictures, it's unbelievable the characterization that you see that Michelangelo has accomplished as you see these individuals after the judgment crossing over the river Styx, as it were, to a future of unending torment, and you could see it on their face. There is no hope for them, and that will be the case. that will be the second surprise. The first surprise, death, comes quickly in many cases. Maybe the majority, I don't know. But certainly for many. And the second surprise is what they experience on the other side. They will not be at peace. R.I.P., rest in peace. For many, there will be no peace and there will be no rest because there is no forgiveness. Because they have rejected that option in this life and they live with the consequences in the next life. Not so for Bonnie. And over the years, I watched as my little sister struggled with a host of challenges. I mean, some were the result of growing up in the Koukl family. It was chaotic. It was crazy. Lots of unhealthy things, like many families are. Dysfunctional. And some people are scarred more by that than others. Bonnie was the youngest. Some of the things she faced were the result of consequences of decisions that she made during her own life that descended on her later in life. The smoking, the cancer, and other things. Okay, that's part of it. But I also watched Bonnie face those challenges courageously. Now, sometimes it was her personal grit, and I'm telling you, this gal had a lot of grit. And that helped her move forward. But that wasn't enough. And it never is enough. Moving forward on your own power. As time went on, she shifted. Her center shifted. Her focus shifted. And she increasingly placed her life in her Savior's hands and trusted him completely, even when things seemed hopeless. And this was so evident in the last 6 months. As things got worse and worse, and she lost more and more weight. She said she would communicate with the rest of us in a group text, the family thing, and she'd say, God doesn't owe me healing. I belong to him. I'm trusting him, whatever it is he decides. And so she placed her life in her Savior's hands, trusting him completely, even when things seemed hopeless. It's not how she started her race, but that is how she finished. And for all the hard challenges in Bonnie's life, and you think of your own or other people's lives, life is hard. For all the hard challenges for her, she exited safely in Jesus' arms forever. So regardless of her beginnings, Bonnie had the best of endings. And I will see her again. Well, let's have a break, and we'll come back with your calls all lined up here. I'll chat with you soon. Okay, friends. I guess one takeaway from my last comments is, and I see it in my notes, I didn't say it. It's never too late. Until it's too late, I guess. Until it's over, it's never too late. But don't wait. Don't wait. All right, let's go to Newbury Park in Southern California here. And Darren, you're right down the road from where I live in Thousand Oaks.
Well, hello, Greg Koukl.
Hey.
Wow, I'm almost speechless after your open. It was very moving.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was wondering if it would be helpful. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, it is. First things first, gosh, my wife and I have been listening to you since the 6-hour weekends on K-Bright.
No kidding.
That goes.
Man,
yep.
You're an old timer.
Well, you know what we appreciate about you and STR, Greg, is you guys have just been such a clear megaphone for the truth of Scripture and the Lord, and it's been to our benefit, and we just, we appreciate it, and we thank you so much for that.
Well, you're very welcome, and I'm really glad to hear that. This is like, what is this, my 33rd year? KBRT days, that was 1991 when I started in February 91, and worked with them until 98, and then Stand to Reason took over that broadcast, as it turned out. But anyway, what's on your mind, Darren?
Well, I didn't. It's funny. I didn't expect my main point to sort of dovetail into what you said, but about 3 years ago, my wife and I lost one of our boys after a 12-year battle with mental illness and addiction. And I think it dovetails into what you said about some of the consequences we do and some of the battles that we can face. And the main reason I called was that a very well-known local pastor, I don't have to say his name, but I mean, this person has a global platform.
Sure.
And we benefited enormously from his ministry for decades. But this person was at a conference, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago. And not basically, I have the quote, but he when asked about mental illness, he basically said that mental illness does not exist. There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as ADHD, that they're just noble lies. And after our 12-year battle with our son, and then ultimately losing him, I mean, it just hit us like a gut punch.
Right.
And the good thing about it, he's like your sister Bonnie. Our son was regenerate, so that's a great takeaway. It's what gives us joy. But as you know now, with your sister, the ripples you still suffer. Well, we're here, you're there, and they're consequential. And but to me, the bigger picture was for somebody with this pastor's stature to come out and say there's no such thing as mental illness, caused me to do a very deep dive into it. And you guys have a great article. I think it's called "Is the Bible Sufficient?" And I think that goes back 10 or 12 years ago, so I'm not sure exactly what it was referring to, but it seemed to really dovetail into this issue. And
it was written in response to that point of view, and and of course the question is sufficient for what, and that's what one person has to be clear on. It is sufficient for some things; it's not sufficient for other things. So, it is sufficient to provide what we need for godliness. That's the point of the 2 Timothy 3 passage. But that doesn't mean that every single malady of the human condition, the fallen human condition, can be corrected by making an appeal to some scriptural reality and standing on that. I don't think it's too hard for anybody, certainly me at this point, to figure out who might have made the comment. Okay,
right. I knew you would.
and I think it's obviously false, and I have a tremendous respect for this individual and have learned so much from him over the years. But ironically, he's reformed. And the idea of total depravity is the understanding that every area of our life is influenced by sin. And there's no sense of inappropriate triumphalism in Christianity, generally in his ministry, that the proper application of a Bible passage will solve every single problem. No, we endure through the difficulties as best we can, seeking to follow scriptural guidelines to live godly in difficult circumstances. And part of the impact of the fall, the total depravity, that means not that man is as bad as he could be, but that every area of his life is influenced by the fall. And so consequently, there are going to be mental problems. Okay, the fact that, look, just take PTSD. Men go into battle, and battle is brutal. Sometimes doing the right thing, and I think it's right to take human lives under certain circumstances, but sometimes doing the right thing is still destructive to the soul when you live in a fallen world. And that destruction to the soul is not repaired simply by following certain scriptural guidelines, because it was not meant to repair all those things, I don't think. And there are people that are just wonderful Christians that suffer from PTSD of all sorts. And I'm just thinking of, for example, that associated with battle, which is probably the most severe. Okay. But that's just a reality. When a person has PTSD, they need help. And they need help from people who have learned, because of the common grace of God, how the human soul works in some measure, just like doctors understand how the body works and works out antidotes to physical problems. There are appropriate antidotes to mental problems, the soulish side, and even people who are not Christian can still come up with appropriate antidotes that are consistent with a Christian worldview, even if they don't acknowledge God. Now, a lot of these folks, obviously, they're in a whole different place, whole different worldview, and you've got to be careful, okay? But ADHD, I know people who have ADHD, okay? Now, there are ways to deal with these things. There are responsible things you can do. I have a book called Driven to Distraction. All right. It's a great book about ADHD. If anybody has a relative or a loved one with ADHD, that's the book to go to. And then here are all these motifs. You can do this. You can make lists. You can be accountable to people. You can do this, that, and the other thing. You're not going to find all of these things in the Bible, but you're going to find that many of these things are consistent with biblical teaching. Accountability, for example, being industrious. That's in the book of Proverbs. Well, then what does industry look like given this challenge? Well, that's something that we can work out as human beings by reflecting on the nature of the challenge with the mental abilities, the insight, the wisdom that God has given us, and figure out workarounds given this kind of problem. And to say, what about autism? That's a mental illness. What about obsessive compulsive behavior? There are people that are obsessive compulsive. How could anybody say that that's not a reality? That's not just a make-me-up. Now,
well, I think what was shocking for us, Greg, is my wife and I are going on 4 decades of being believers, and we had never encountered this point of view. Maybe we didn't get out enough, but I think it really stunned us. I mean, my wife lost sleep over it. She goes, I can't believe this person would hold that view.
Mm-hmm. Well, that person,
and then double, quadruple down on it, because we've kind of followed the story,
sure,
and gone deeper, and just
Well, look, that's not the only thing that this person is mistaken on. All right, but I'm just going to tell you something. Quite frankly, I'm mistaken on a bunch of things. I'm sure. I just don't know what those things are.
Agreed.
So everybody has their shortcomings, their blind spots, their fallibilities, and we can do the best we can to shore up our stock of true beliefs and get rid of our false beliefs. But that's part of the challenge of living in a fallen world. So I am not going to be dismissive of this individual, for example, who has so much good to offer, just like lots of other teachers, because I don't like this particular view that he has. It just strikes me as obviously false and difficult, makes things difficult for a lot of people, especially when it comes from a very a person who has authority and sound judgment in so many biblical issues. So, but this statement just strikes me as obviously false, the way you've characterized it, that there's no such thing as mental illness. Please, that's just foolishness.
And I do think, Greg, they're not part of a denomination, but those kind of statements, because later he went on to say, medicine's bad, so there could be tremendous repercussions from people hearing that and thinking they shouldn't take their meds. I mean, that can be potentially harmful.
Yeah, I agree. J.P. Moreland has written a book about this because J.P. Moreland has mental illness. One of my mentors, one of the most esteemed philosophers in the country, Christian philosophers, that is, but he wrote a book about it. And I don't agree with everything in his book, but I certainly agree that mental illness is not a sin. It isn't an example of giving into a fantasy, and it isn't an evidence of lack of spirituality. It is a real condition that needs to be addressed. And there are biblical principles that will be helpful in addressing those things. Okay, no question about that. But it isn't like just find the right Bible verse and you'll be fine, and just apply these principles. Say, for example, being there's a passage in Philippians says to be anxious for nothing, but there's a couple of things. One is be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. So this is a principle. We put this into play, okay?
Yes.
The peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. But there's a verse that follows that. That's part of the whole pericope, that whole section. And it says, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, let your mind, if there's anything excellence or anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things. Now, I think this is part of that package. You want the peace of God, well, then you've got to discipline your thinking, okay? So this is something we can apply to our lives, no question, all right? And there are times when people who are not Christians understand that principle and will encourage that kind of behavior in a counseling session, all right? Or if we read in Proverbs, it says be industrious. There's a lot of Proverbs that talk about industry, okay? Well, how does a person who has ADHD and they don't finish things? They move on to other things and leave all these unfinished tasks. Well, how do they exercise the virtue of productivity? Well, in that book I mentioned just a moment ago, Driven to Distraction, there are some guidelines about how practical ways that you can be more productive and industrious given the distraction of ADHD. All right. So I think these things all work together. And I do share with the pastor in question a concern for a psychological counseling community that in many ways is completely adverse to biblical morality.
Absolutely agree.
And I mean, it's gotten terrible. Yes. But they are still human beings that are made in the image of God, and they can still understand the truth of the world. And if we are careful, some of the things that they suggest that are modalities for us to deal with mental illness, just like physicians have modalities to deal with physical illness, some of those modalities are going to become completely consistent with a Christian worldview, and we can integrate those.
Right.
So, but to write them all off is just a mistake. This piece that I wrote, and I'm trying to remember, you must have read it online.
I did. It's a great piece.
Yeah, and I think that is the Bible sufficient? And there might be a piece that I wrote that's called "Is Biblical Counseling Biblical?" And this whole idea, they're integrated. Like biblical counseling requires a certain approach to these problems that I think the pastor in question would agree with. But I don't know that kind of approach taken as an absolute is actually consistent with the Scriptures. Ironically, that are the ones that are being used to justify the approach.
Yeah.
So those are two pieces I wrote, and I am concerned that there are Christians that have just received bad counsel from other Christians on this issue. And
last take on it from, because I know you got other callers, but and you just said Christians counseling Christians. Well, what does this mean for non-believers if there's no mental illness? Are they just out of luck? Yeah.
So exactly. Well, it would be, I think, maybe the response would be that whatever their experience is just sin in their life. I don't know what else to call it. If it's not an illness and it's an aberration, it's not right, and it's not an illness, it must be a sin. I don't know what the other options are. And I don't mean at all to misrepresent any Christian's view, but I think you're right. Raises a concern. There are people who love the Lord. Listen, I know people intimately who love the Lord with all their heart and are struggling with different versions of mental illness.
Yes.
So I don't know what the name of J.P. Moreland's book is on this issue. It came out maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but he's actually quite candid about it. And there's one called Finding Rest or something like that where he talks about it. There might be another one that he wrote. I don't agree with everything that's in those books about the best way to deal with these things. That there's a discussion that's open for that, and we should have. But to take the other side and say that mental illness is a myth, that's goofy, and it's obviously false. And so this is occasion where we say, with all due respects, eat the meat, throw away the bones.
Right.
All right.
Well, look, Greg, I appreciate your thoughts and blessings. And
Thank
we're
you.
sorry about Bonnie, but we're happy for her destiny. So, thanks.
Well,
thanks, Greg.
thank you, Darren. Thanks so much for the call. Bye-bye now.
Have a good day. All right, bye.
Bye. All right. We're going to skip our breaks here because we have so many people on board. It's great to see all the lights flashing when I come back from being away for a bit. So let's see. Let's go to Ed here in Bakersfield, California. Ed, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Glad to be on. Just to get straight to it, I'm just having, I guess, a little confusion with dispensationalism and the gospel.
Uh-huh.
Is there differences like what a Reformed type church or teaching would be with a dispensational type church regarding, our salvation or the gospel?
Well, the simple answer, taking those different, in a certain sense, theological systems, the dispensational system and the Reformed view is characteristically covenantal system, the answer is no. There is no difference in the issue of the gospel message and salvation. The differences are of a different sort. It's how you characterize let me back up and put it this way. Dispensationalism teaches that there is, I was just thinking about this recently. In fact, this morning, my reading in Joel, of all places, teaches that there is a distinction, a covenant distinction between promises that God made to national Israel and promises that apply to the church. There are two distinct covenants there. National Israel is grounded initially in the Abrahamic covenant, in which God promises to make Israel a great nation for a particular purpose, and that purpose is to reach the world with a blessing. The new covenant is detail on what that blessing is. It's complete, permanent, personal forgiveness and the giving of the Holy Spirit. Okay, that is part of the new covenant. We read about it in Jeremiah 31 and following, and the book of Ezekiel 37, and other places. We have reference to it in the 3rd chapter of Joel. I was just reading about that this morning. Okay, but this is where there's debate with a kind of, and this is it is a way of looking at Scripture, but it's an eschatological distinction. How do things work themselves out in the end? Is the detail, and it has to do with world history. I don't mean with salvation. And I'm a dispensationalist. In other words, I think that there are two distinct covenants, and the covenant of the salvation covenant, which is the new covenant, is given to the Jews to replace the Mosaic covenant. And that's clear in Jeremiah 31 and 31, verse 31 and following. But the Gentiles, though this is a Jewish covenant, the Gentiles have been grafted in, and the book of Romans talks about this. So we participate in a Jewish covenant by virtue of our faith in Jesus. And if Jews do not believe in Jesus, they are not beneficiaries of the new covenant. But that doesn't cancel out the role of the Abrahamic covenant that establishes them as a distinct people with a promise of the land and a kind of future. And that is the distinction with dispensationalism and any other form understanding of how these things play out, like covenant theology. Of course, I believe in covenants, but the way you understand these covenant relationships are going to be different with Reformed folk than you have with dispensational types. And by the way, some Reformed people are dispensational, all right? So Talbot, for example, Talbot is a dispensational, their theology, but they are also Reformed in their theology department. So they're like me in that regard.
What would make them reform?
Pardon me?
What would make them deformed or reformed and dispensational? How?
Because they're not competing with each other. These views are not competing with each other. When I say Reformed, I just mean simply the belief in sovereign grace and divine election. Divine election in the sense that God is the one who chooses his people. They're called the elect because he's electing them. They're called the chosen because he chooses them. And in virtue of his election and his choosing of them, they become believers. So God is the one ultimately responsible for their salvation, not them. That's the Reformed view. The Arminian view flips that over and says that human beings are ultimately responsible for a salvation that God offers. Okay? So Reformed folk are Calvinists, essentially, in that regard.
Okay.
And Reformed folk, characteristically, when it comes to this other area of theology, are covenant in their views. And I can't get into detail of that right now, but that is in contrast to dispensational, which holds that even though we're all saved by grace, new covenant, there still is a promise that God has made to national Israel for a land and a people and a nation, that he is going to keep the promises to national Israel. That's the key distinction.
Would that also include like their salvation too? Or
it's not. It doesn't include. No, it doesn't on its own.
So it's just they just have like a promise of the land and to be classified as a people, God's people.
And the promise also that they will be a blessing to the world. Now, God intended them to participate in the blessing, but that depended on another step. And they are not chosen for salvation. They are chosen for the purpose I just described in Genesis chapter 12, verses, is that right, Genesis 12? Yeah, verses 1 through 3. And more detail there in Genesis 15 is given, and etc. But the chosenness is not for salvation. The chosenness is to be an instrument by God in the world, and he makes them a nation to be that instrument. But the blessing that that the Jews were meant to provide for the world was a blessing that the Jews were also supposed to participate in. But that requires faith in God's provision of Messiah. And that's the new covenant. My suggestion is, if you're up to it, go to our store. It's str.org, and there's a course that I teach that's called The Bible Fast Forward. And I go into detail there of making these distinctions. God has made a boatload of promises through the prophets to Israel, national Israel, about the land and the national prosperity that God is not going to go back on. In fact, there's a very strong restatement of that promise in Jeremiah 31 after the new covenant information is given, that God is not going to abandon his people. Now, taken in context, that's the Jewish people. And I just read Joel chapter 3. There it is again. I will not abandon my people. These are my people. I will pour out my spirit on my people. Okay, that's the Jews. Now, he's also pouring out his spirit on Gentiles. All right? And those are Gentiles who have participated in one of the Jewish covenants. That is the new covenant. And that is the salvation covenant. And it's not guaranteed to all Jews. But what is guaranteed to national Israel is this promise that God made in the Abrahamic covenant, and some will call it Palestinian covenant, as he goes on further to clarify the extent of the land that he's promised to them.
So is it meant to be this confusing?
Sir, say again?
Is it meant to be this confusing? Maybe.
Well,
I think when I'm listening to you and listening to others, it gets confusing.
Well, it's not confusing to me, but it is confusing if you don't have kind of the full. There's a lot of things that Christians don't know about what the Bible teaches. Now, I'm not faulting other people because the Bible's a big book, but we learn bits and pieces of New Testament theology, and what we don't often grasp is the larger flow. Now, when I wrote The Story of Reality, I meant to give a super macro look at the Christian worldview: God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. So you get the big, giant picture. But when you go from God to man, Genesis 2 and 3, then you go to Jesus, that's Genesis 3 all the way to the Gospels. That's a big jump. And what I do in the Bible Fast Forward is I fill in that space between man's fall and Jesus arriving to help you see the covenants that God has provided as a stepping stone to the solution for all mankind in Jesus.
Would reform other like reform? Are you reformed then?
Yes.
Oh, you're one of reform dispensationalists? Is that how you classified it?
Say again. I'm sorry.
You classify yourself as being like a reformed dispensationalist?
Correct. Yeah. That's like Talbot. That's the way Talbot is. John MacArthur is an example of that too. And so,
how about like R.C. Sproul?
R.C. Sproul, I'm not sure about him, or Alistair Begg. They're all reformed, but I don't know what their broader understanding is. If they're reformed and confessional, they are probably holding to a so-called covenant view. But and therefore, for many of them, Israel no longer has a role. It's all the church, and that's it. And I just think that's a mistake. But it's not the end of the world. The gospel, and this is part of your original question, the gospel is the same in both cases. It's the very same gospel. All right. Now, it may be that there are dispensational that are Arminian, so there might be obviously some differences between Arminian and Reformed or Calvinists. But the message of the gospel is the same in both cases. In my view, at least, it's just there's what's going on behind the scenes is going to be different. Even Reformed people, when they communicate the gospel, they do so like Paul and Jesus and John and Peter and the rest of they appeal to people to put their trust in Christ, to follow Jesus, make a decision, if you want to use that language. So the human will is involved. There is a deeper question as to what is it that is ultimately behind people making a decision for Christ or against him. And that's where you're going to have a difference between Arminians and Reform types or Calvinists, okay? They're going to have a different view. Nevertheless, the gospel going out, the preachment of the gospel is going to be the same words and the same concept of sola fide, faith alone, sola Christo, Christ alone, and et cetera, et cetera. We are saved by Jesus alone through faith alone. And that's going to be true on both sides of the equation here.
Okay. This might be a little bit off, and I'm sorry taking time, but in Matthew, Jesus says that the kingdom is taken away from, I guess he was talking to the Pharisees and to the teachers. I haven't been able to find it. Do you know, it's like in Matthew 21 or some.
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me. I just got like 45 seconds left here in this segment. But I can appreciate that there are passages that people say, what the heck is going on here? And the fact is, and we'll just leave you with this thought here, okay? The fact is that there are things in the Scripture that sometimes are hard to understand at first glance. And what you have to do is go back and put the stepping stones in place. And when the stones are in place, many of these things come together, and they begin to make more sense. But the stones have to be in place. And the Jews, first century, they had a lot of those things in order. They understood all of these things because that was their religious history. But for us, now 2,000 years later, we got to put the pieces in place. And I think what I suggested is listening to the Bible Fast Forward, because in 8 sessions, 50 minutes each, I try to put those pieces in place. Anyway, hope that helps. Greg Koukl here for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven, friends. Bye-bye now.